Thank you. Thank you for having me here. I just spoke to my daughter who said, just take a deep breath in and out, and you will be fine. So I'm going to talk about intention. There is a saying in the Upanishads, which is one of the greatest texts of India, and it goes, "You are what your deepest desire is. As is your desire, so is your intent. As is your intent, so is your will. As is your will, so is your deed. As is your deed, so is your destiny." I spent a lot of time thinking about intention. I do have a popular website called intent.com, and I know some of you are on it, and I hope to see others there as well. Recently, I've been thinking about how intent translates into deeds or actions and ultimately shapes our destiny. So, many of you have probably heard of my father, the best-selling author Deepak Chopra. Some of you may see him as a successful doctor or author or a very controversial personality. But I see my father simply as my father. I see him in the context of the legacy and those that came before him. And I realize that my family, like all families, has its own unique story. Every generation has been shaped by the political and social context of its time. Every generation has had the intent for survival, for education, for prosperity, for success, for purpose, meaning, significance. And every generation has realized its intent in its own unique way and then set the intents for the generation that follows. So let me tell you a little bit about my family. We called my grandfather Daddy. In the 1800s, Daddy's grandfather, that's 4 generations before me, in India was a feudal lord. He was a proud man who toiled his lands and took care of everyone who was in his surrounding vicinity. I remember very clearly when I was a kid, my grandfather telling me that his grandfather was a hero. When the British came to India at that time, his grandfather would not back down. His intent was to protect his family, his community, and his land. And he fought till his last breath, dying valiantly on the battlefield to protect his family. So his destiny was to really represent the pride of India as the tides turned to British rule. Well, Daddy's father, my great-grandfather, had a very different intent. His intent was survival for himself and for his family. He was given some money by the British for the murder of his father, and he decided that the best way to survive was actually to educate his family. So he made sure that both his boys and girls, daughters and sons, were educated. And it was in that education that my grandfather discovered his passion for medicine. We have in our family story the story of my great-grandfather. When the night he heard that my grandfather had graduated from medical school in England, he went to the rooftops and shot his gun in celebration. He then went back to bed and actually died that same night, and he fulfilled his destiny. So my grandfather, Daddy, actually has really shaped my family's current iteration. Daddy's passion for medicine led him to study harder than anyone else in his community, and he got an internship to work in the British Army, and he was able to follow other doctors as they did his rounds. And in that time, his intent was to become a doctor, but that was really not an attainable goal for an Indian at the time. Well, my grandfather took copious notes, and as he followed all these doctors, he would mentally decide what the diagnosis and prognosis of each case was. But as a brownie, or as an Indian, he was not allowed to participate. Well, one day there was a particularly difficult case, and none of the doctors could answer the question. So the senior doctor, probably with the intent to humiliate my grandfather, actually put him on the spot and said, "Well, Mr. Chopra, what do you think?" And my grandfather made, confidently, the correct diagnosis and treatment in the case. So the senior British doctor was very impressed, and he decided that he was going to champion my grandfather to go to England to study medicine, again, something that was really unusual at the time. And my grandfather ended up becoming one of the first cardiologists in India. So my grandfather's intent to heal has really shaped us. When he came back to India, at about 22, he married my grandmother, Ma, who we called her Ma. And Ma was beautiful, she was well-spoken, articulate, fiercely protective of those she loved and those in her community. Indian independence came, and my grandmother and grandfather, my grandfather became a colonel in now the Indian Army, and they were stationed to a small town at that time called Jabalpur, which is in northern India. And it was this time that my dad was probably 10 and my uncle was probably 8 that really shaped their destiny. People in all the surrounding villages basically heard about this healer who had come to town. They would travel by foot, most of them extremely poor, to meet this healer who provided sage advice, medicine, and compassion to those who were suffering. And when they arrived, my grandmother would welcome them with blankets, clothing, food. She'd secretly give them the medicine. She'd secretly give them the money to buy medicine and to buy everything that they needed to get home. So what they got was not just physical healing, but emotional and spiritual healing as well. And my dad and my uncle tell quite emotionally the story of when they left Jabalpur to move to the next town. When they arrived at the train station, there was a mass of humanity waiting there. Thousands and thousands of people had traveled again to come with gifts, with Indian sweets, with tears in their eyes and gratitude to thank this great doctor and his wife who had healed so many. So this probably shaped my father's intent. And he says that his intent is to create a just, sustainable, peaceful, and healthy planet. But I really think my dad's original intent was to heal just in the way that my grandfather did. So my grandfather basically forced my father to become a doctor, not a typical thing in an Indian family. My dad actually originally wanted to be a journalist and tell stories to inspire people, but his father made him become a doctor. And when he was about 22 years old, he moved to this country to complete his medical education with his young wife, my mother, Rita. When they arrived here, they had $8 in their pocket. They had never seen a colored television, had no idea what credit or a credit card was, and no idea really what to expect. And I really think my parents are actually the American dream realized. They worked hard. They felt years of loneliness. They struggled often financially, probably more so culturally. But in the end, they created a life for my brother and I that was, one, comfortable, we were educated, but also imbued in us the sense that if you believed you could do something, then you can. My parents were also shaped by the culture of their times, the 60s and 70s, the years of JFK, the Vietnam War, the peace movement, the civil rights movement, women's issues. And when my father began talking about the mind-body connection, he was labeled an East Asian witch doctor who sold snake oil. So today we find it really funny that there's yoga on every corner and meditation is so common. But my dad basically taught us over the last 3 decades that by believing in yourself and what your message is and sticking to it, he has found both success and notoriety. So now we come to my chapter in this crazy story that started with the British invading India, my grandfather becoming this great doctor, and my father and mother realizing the American dream. So my intent is also shaped by history. I was 5 months pregnant on 9/11. And I remember that morning, my father called me to wake me up, and he was hysterical on the other end of the phone. He had just landed in Detroit, and to the news of the first plane crashing, and he was convinced that my brother was on that plane. He couldn't speak, he was completely hysterical, and my mother was actually also on a plane traveling from London to Boston, and as we were on the phone, the second plane crashed. It took us a couple hours to realize, for us, relief that my brother was not on that plane, but also the horror of what actually happened. And it was 2 days later, on September 13th, that I actually was going for a walk and I fainted. And basically the stress of the day and everything had just pushed my pregnant body too far. And I realized while I was in the hospital for a few days under observation that it was probably the first time in my life that I actually started to ask myself really deep questions. Who am I? And what do I want? I realized I was bringing this new life, this new soul, into a planet that was suffering. I was really excited and joyful, but I was really fearful at the same time. And while I wanted to believe in peace and love, the reality was we're living in a world that's full of hatred, inequality, and a lot of injustice. So I realized that my intent is to be a good mom. My intent is to give my kids the tools to be good citizens, to be compassionate, to be empathetic. I can look at my ancestors now and look at their stories, their trials and tribulations, and realize that each one figured out how to realize their destiny. I spent a lot of time thinking about my mother, and I really thought about her patience and everything she had done to give me the voice to do what I want to do in the world. And I realized that actually out of all those that came before me, it was my mom who actually had the biggest impact. I also thought a lot about a phrase my dad used to make my brother and I say after we meditated, and it goes like this: I am responsible for what I see. I choose the feelings I experience and set the goals I will achieve. And everything that seems to happen to me, I ask for and receive as I have asked. And my dad would ask my brother and I then, what do you ask for? And obviously, we'd ask for tickets to the Celtics game and a trip to Hawaii, an Atari game, that's how old I am. He'd listen patiently, and then he'd say, okay, well, what about asking for love, hope, inspiration, connection, knowledge, purpose, meaning, significance? And so we were taught to set our intents every day for what we wanted as qualities in our life. So out of our deepest desires, we set the intent for what we want to achieve in our life. Intents aren't goals. They are who we aspire to be at our deepest, most fundamental level. In meditation, we often ask ourselves, who am I? And I've thought a lot about that question. And the more I think about it, the more mysterious it becomes, because I realize that I am part of my culture, my environment, my experiences, but I'm also part of this larger story and this larger legacy that brought me here. And my story and the story of my children is still unfolding. My children are growing up in a completely multicultural environment, much like this room. Their classrooms are filled with kids from India, Japan, China, African Americans, Latinos, Europeans, and mixed kids. My nephew actually is half Chinese and half Indian. So our story, our family story, has so much potential. And my hope is to imbue in my kids the sense of magic and mystery from the stories that came before them. When you know what came before you, it inspires humility. It inspires reverence for life. And in today's troubled times, reverence for life is really of the utmost importance. This week, we experienced again a horrible terrorist attack. And we realized once again the tenuousness and the preciousness of life. Hopefully, while we all may be dealing with a lot of fear, we also saw that humanity is loving, people want to help each other, and they're everyday heroes. And also, we hopefully reaffirmed our values to be catalysts for change for a better world. There is a Native American tradition that asks the individual, in making any decision, to think about the parents' parents, and the parents' parents, as well as the children's children, and the children's children. When we think of ourselves in the context of a continuum, when we think of ourselves of something that's bigger than ourselves, then I believe we feel a deeper sense of significance in our planet. So I'd like to take my precious last minute to do an exercise with all of you. And please don't be intimidated. It's a very short 1-minute meditation, and actually it's here at Berkeley that meditation first was discovered in the West. So I'd like you to sit comfortably, close your eyes, and I'll tell you what to do. So close your eyes, take a deep breath, and as you're breathing in, mentally say I. And as you're breathing out, mentally say am. I am. I am. Continue mentally saying I am, and I'm going to ask you a few questions. Don't feel the need to answer the questions. Just continue to breathe in saying I, and breathe out saying am. Who am I? Who am I? What's my story? What's my story? What do I want? How can I serve? Please take a deep breath, and when you're ready, you can open your eyes. So may you all find the wisdom and the inspiration to realize your own destiny. Thank you.